Somewhere west of the Jade Gate, in the year 313 of the Common Era, a leather pouch stopped moving. We don't know exactly how it happened. Perhaps the courier was turned back by soldiers. Perhaps the road ahead had simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, eaten by the chaos spreading east from Luoyang, where an empire was coming apart at its stitches. What we know is this. The pouch found its way inside the wall of a mud-brick watchtower, roughly 90 kilometers west of the garrison town of Dunhuang, at a fortified outpost guarding the western approaches to that desert city. And there it stayed, not for a decade, not for a century. For 1600 years the letters inside lay sealed in their leather wrapping, held in the dry dark while dynasties rose and fell, while the road outside the tower walls filled with sand, while the very language written on those pages passed out of living memory and into silence. In 1907, a British archaeologist named Aurel Stein found them there. What he pulled from the rubble were 5 nearly complete letters, written in a flowing script called Sogdian, a language spoken by an Iranian merchant people who, for 5 centuries, had functioned as the nervous system of long-distance trade across Central Asia. 2 of those letters came from a woman in distress who had been abandoned in Dunhuang, left there while the world outside the city gates grew increasingly dangerous. The remaining letters concerned the commercial anxieties and collapsing circumstances of Sogdian merchants trying to make sense of a world coming undone. But first, who were these people, and what were they doing at the far edge of the known world? The Sogdians were, in many ways, the Silk Road's truest citizens. They built colonies in Chinese cities. They kept accounts in 3 languages. They married across every border that more rigid peoples considered permanent. And in the early 4th century, in the middle of a catastrophe they could not yet fully comprehend, some of them sat down and wrote letters home. These 5 letters are now considered the earliest substantial examples of Sogdian writing known to scholarship, not carved into monuments, not pressed into state documents. Letters, personal letters, folded and sealed and sent by frightened, exhausted, ordinary people who needed someone on the other end of a very long road to know what was happening to them. 2 of those letters were from a woman. We don't know her name. What we know is that she had been abandoned in Dunhuang and that she was writing to people who had not come for her. The 2 letters she sent, known as Letters 1 and 3, are dispatches of distress, written with a directness that still lands like a stone in still water after all this time. She is asking to be rescued. She is asking why no one has come. She is asking, in the measured language of someone who has decided that dignity costs nothing to keep even when everything else is gone, whether anyone on the other side of the mountains has received her previous messages. They had not, or if they had, no rescue came. The letters never left the tower. This moment crystallizes what the Silk Road looks like up close through this particular window into 313 CE. A woman, stranded in a desert garrison town at the edge of the known world, writing letters that will not arrive to people who may already be dead, about an empire in the process of collapsing around her. And then there is letter 2, written not by her, but by a Sogdian merchant from Guzang in the Hexi corridor. He is writing, like his colleague, into what feels like a void, reaching through paper and distance towards some anchor of normalcy. What these 2 letters share is the same vertigo, the same quality of testimony from inside a rupture. The woman's letters record the human cost of the system breaking down. The merchant's letter records the symptoms of the same collapse. He writes of chaos, of impossible conditions, of the difficulty of moving goods and maintaining contact. And in describing the calamity overtaking the Chinese heartland, he reaches for a sentence that has survived 16 centuries precisely because it captures something essential about the nausea of watching an established order disappear. Yeah, he writes, these same Huns who yesterday were the emperor's subjects. Yesterday, not 10 years ago, not in the memory of grandfathers. Yesterday. The word is doing enormous work in that sentence. It carries the specific vertigo of a world that has been reclassified without warning. The Huns who were subjects, who were contained, who were on the correct side of the border between order and chaos, are now somewhere in the ruins of the world the merchant knew. The letter does not even confirm whether the Chinese managed to expel them. It doesn't know. That uncertainty is the point, and a merchant in a corridor town, writing towards Samarkand, is trying to convey that the trade routes through the center of the world have become considerably more dangerous, and that he is not sure anyone is listening. Neither letter arrived. None of them did. Stein found them bundled together in that watchtower, apparently confiscated by a Chinese garrison at some point, when Chinese authority in that far western stretch was already fraying. They may have been seized as intelligence. They may simply have been abandoned when the garrison itself withdrew. The scholars who have studied these letters most closely, including Professor Nicholas Sims Williams of the University of London, whose arguments about the dating have been the most persuasive, place the letters at approximately 313 to 314 CE, which means they were written in the same years that the Roman Empire to the west was consolidating under Constantine, at the precise moment when the great Eurasian trading system these Sogdian merchants had helped build was experiencing one of its first major ruptures. The pattern that these letters reveal does not fit the story we usually tell about the Silk Road. The story we usually tell is one of gleaming connectivity, of silk moving west and glassware moving east, and ideas crossing mountains like water finds its level, of a road, or roads really, a braided network of routes across the steppes and deserts of Central Asia that functioned as civilization's great conveyor belt, moving the best of each culture toward all the others. This story is not wrong exactly, it is simply incomplete, dangerously incomplete, because it leaves out the woman stranded in Dunhuang, it leaves out the merchant writing into chaos from the Hexi corridor, it leaves out the sense, present in every line of those 5 documents, that the people actually living on the Silk Road experienced it not as a symbol of connection, but as a dangerous, uncertain, deeply human enterprise that could fail at any moment. What if we have been looking at the Silk Road from the wrong direction all along, not from the palaces at either end, where emperors received bolts of silk and exotic animals and glowing accounts of distant lands, but from the middle, from the watchtowers and oasis towns and desert crossings where the actual work was done, from the leather pouch inside the collapsed wall. What does the Silk Road look like from there? It looks like a woman writing her 3rd letter home, not knowing if the first 2 were ever read. It looks like a merchant pressing ink to paper in the voice of someone who is trying very hard not to sound afraid. It looks, in short, like us, like every human system that has ever tried to hold the world together with infrastructure and goodwill and the assumption that tomorrow will resemble today. The Silk Road is older than the name given to it. The name itself was coined by a German geologist named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, centuries after the roots had already fallen silent, already been buried, already been half forgotten by the civilizations that had depended on them. It is stranger than the maps suggest, and it contains, pressed into its documents and buried in its sands, and encoded in its mummies and its manuscripts and its half-drowned cities, a story that our conventional histories have barely begun to tell. That story starts not with emperors or explorers. It starts with a dozen animals picking their way between oasis towns, with cracked lips and a horizon that could kill you, with the caravan you never picture when you picture the Silk Road. The letters were waiting 1,600 years. Now we start reading them. Not the grand procession of the paintings, not the 1,000-camel column you might picture, banners snapping in the wind, coffers heavy with Chinese silk and Roman gold. Imagine instead a dozen animals, perhaps fewer, picking their way in single file between 2 oasis towns separated by 4 days of waterless desert. The men who drive them know every dune by its shape, every dry stream bed by the sound the sand makes when the wind crosses it a certain way. They are not merchants of empire. They are nervous men with cracked lips and eyes always scanning the horizon, because the desert does not distinguish between a rich caravan and a foolish one. Between them and the next water source lies a distance that could kill them if a single thing goes wrong. A lame camel, a sandstorm, a misjudgment of direction by half a degree. This is what the Silk Road actually looked like. Not a road at all, not a single highway, not even a coherent network in any sense that would satisfy a modern logistician. A series of relays between Oasis towns, each link in the chain operated by different people under different rulers, speaking different languages, offering different prices. A merchant who began his journey in Chang'an in the east might travel for weeks before handing his goods to another man entirely, who would carry them the next leg, who would hand them to another and another and another, until those goods arrived somewhere on the other end of Eurasia, and no single person had travelled the whole distance. No one person needed to. No one person usually did. And here is the first problem. Here is the crack in the foundation of the story we have been telling about this road for a very long time. The name itself is a lie. Or not a lie exactly. An invention. A romantic projection, backward across 15 centuries, by a German geologist working in the late 19th century. Ferdinand von Richthofen coined the term in 1877, Silk Roads, and the name lodged itself in the imagination of the Western world with a grip that nothing, not evidence, not scholarship, not a century and a half of archaeological correction, has been able to loosen entirely. The routes were active for more than 1,000 years. The people who travelled them, who built the caravanserais, who woke before dawn to load their animals and check the sky for weather, who wrote letters home that would not arrive for months, who prayed at shrines and haggled over prices and died of thirst and disease in places that had no names. None of them called it the Silk Road. The name did not exist. The concept it encodes, this tidy ribbon of commerce connecting civilization to civilization, did not exist. What existed was messier, more human, more interesting if you are willing to look at it clearly. Valerie Hansen, professor of history at Yale, has looked at it closely, and what she has argued challenges the route's most enduring assumptions. According to Hansen, the Silk Road was one of the least travelled routes in human history. Possibly not worth studying, she wrote, if tonnage carried, or traffic, or the number of travellers at any one time were the sole measures of a given route's significance. Read that again. One of the least travelled routes in human history. The thing we have turned into a metaphor for ancient globalization, for the great churning interchange of the pre-modern world, was, by the ordinary measures of commercial importance, a thin trickle, not a river, a thread. A fragile, improbable thread stretched across mountains and deserts and the political borders of a dozen hostile kingdoms. But obscurity is not the same as insignificance. In fact, it is the obscure currents that reshape civilizations most thoroughly, because Hansen did not stop there. What emerges from a close reading of the evidence, when you look not at the goods, but at everything else, is something that the romantic image of the Silk Road had always obscured by making it too grand, too commercial, too Roman and Chinese. The road's significance rested not in trade, but as a cultural artery for the exchange between East and West of religions, art, languages, and new technologies. The artery that carried Buddhism from India into China, that carried Nestorian Christianity deep into Central Asia. That moved the sounds of Persian music into the courts of the Tang dynasty and brought Chinese papermaking west until it reached the Arab world and, eventually, the printing presses of Europe. The goods were almost incidental. The ideas were everything. But the irony deepens when you ask what actually moved along these routes, because it was not primarily silk. Silk moved along these routes. Of course it did. The Chinese had guarded the secret of silk production for much of antiquity and the early, medieval period, and for a time the fabric commanded the kind of price that makes ordinary economics go strange. But silk was not the main good moving along, as Hansen put it plainly and without drama. The roads carried horses and jade and glass and lapis lazuli and spices and medicines. They carried diseases. They carried musicians and monks and missionaries. They carried stories. The idea that this was primarily a silk road, a commercial infrastructure organized around one luxury textile, is a product of the name, and the name is a product of a man in the late 19th century who was trying to explain something ancient by reaching for something legible. He reached for silk because silk was famous, because silk was the thing Europeans associated with China, because silk was a word that conjured opulence and mystery in the East. It was a name that lodged itself. It was also a distortion. There is another layer to this, and scholar Ravi Mishra has pressed it with a directness that the conventional story has consistently resisted. Too much emphasis, he argues, has been placed on the Han dynasty and Rome, on the great sedentary empires anchoring either end of the route, on the literate civilizations that left records and monuments and the kind of traces that historians are trained to follow. The nomadic peoples and the steppe cultures who actually inhabited the roads, who in Mishra's argument have been largely forgotten from the narrative, these people made the whole enterprise possible. The Sogdians, the Xiongnu, the Scythians, the dozens of other groups who moved through those passes and across those plateaus, who knew the routes not as metaphor, but as the ground beneath their feet. They are inconvenient for the story. They do not fit the image of Silk Road as bridge between empires. They were not an empire. They were something harder to categorize and far harder to erase from the actual record if you read the actual record closely enough. The pattern holds. The people who built the infrastructure are erased from the narrative in favor of the great states they served. So what do we have? We have a name that is wrong, a commodity that is overstated, a volume of traffic that is far smaller than the legend requires. And beneath all of that, beneath the romantic image of a road that never existed as a road, there is something real, something that actually moved across those deserts and through those mountain passes, something that changed every civilization it touched, and did so not through the weight of cargo, but through the slow, almost invisible process of one person handing an idea to another person who carried it forward another leg of the journey. What is the Silk Road, then, if it is not what we were told? That is the question this story is actually about. Not the caravans, though we will follow them. Not the silk, though we will trace it to its source. Not the emperors and the geologists and the romantic projections of the West. But the other thing. The thing that moved when everything else was moving. The living cargo that had no weight. The thing that came into a civilization quietly, like a traveller arriving at an oasis after dark, and by morning had changed everything. The road is a story about what happens when people cannot stop crossing distances that should stop them. And the distance, it turns out, never stopped anyone for long. It did not stop the stone either, and the stone was moving long before anyone thought to name the road. The stone is blue, not the pale blue of winter sky or shallow water, blue like the inside of a dream you cannot quite hold, deep, saturated, absolute. A Sumerian craftsman presses a microblade to its surface, cutting a careful groove, and the dust that rises is the color of midnight. He is shaping a cylindrical bead. He has no idea where the stone came from. He knows only that it is precious beyond almost any measure his world can offer, that the priests want more of it, that the temples are lined with it, that the great dead are buried with it pressed against their skin. He does not know that the raw chunk beneath his hands began its journey in a mountain valley in what we now call Afghanistan. He does not know that it crossed more than 1,200 miles of rugged terrain to reach him, through desert that can kill a man in a day, through mountain passes that close with snow, through the hands of merchants he will never meet, speaking languages he will never learn. He knows only the blue. This is how it always begins, not with silk, not with emperors, with something small and precious and moving through darkness toward a light it cannot see. What if the story we call the Silk Road does not begin with silk at all? What if the impulse, the ferocious, unstoppable human impulse to reach across impossible distances and bring the rare thing home, is thousands of years older than the routes we named? What if the Silk Road was never an invention? What if it was an inheritance? Consider the blue stone. Lapis lazuli is not found everywhere. It does not occur in the polished columns of Mesopotamia or the silted fields along the Euphrates. In the ancient world, it existed in abundance in the Kerano-Munjan district of what is now Afghanistan, in the Hindu Kush, at altitudes where the air is thin and the winters are merciless. A second source exists along the southern shores of Lake Baikal, thousands of miles to the north, but that region lay beyond the practical reach of Sumerian trade networks. For the temples of Mesopotamia, there was, to all meaningful purpose, only one source, one mountain range, one valley. And yet, archaeologists excavating the cities of ancient Sumer have pulled lapis lazuli from the earth in quantity, from temples, from royal graves, from the adornments of gods made of stone and cedar and gold. The metamorphic structure of the lapis found at Sumerian sites in Mesopotamia indicates it came from Afghanistan, over more than 1,200 miles of mountains and desert. This is not a short journey. It is not an easy one. It should not have been possible with the technologies of the early 3rd millennium BCE. And yet the pattern holds. The stone was there, moved by systems we are only beginning to understand. Here is what makes this more than a curiosity, more than a footnote in the history of ancient gemstones. The supply chain that moved lapis lazuli from the Hindu Kush to the temples of Sumer was not simple. It was not a matter of one determined merchant loading his donkey and walking west until he reached the Euphrates. Sumer had no political control over the production centers in Afghanistan. It had no political control over the Iranian plateau that lay between. For a good half of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, the steady flow of lapis into Mesopotamia was guaranteed by something far more sophisticated than conquest. Independent centers on the Iranian plateau functioned as middlemen. Towns and villages, technologically advanced, densely populated, strategically positioned. Archaeology confirms they were sophisticated economic actors. They sat between the source and the consumer. They acquired the raw stone, worked it, moved it along. The merchant had become a full-time worker, stimulating new productive and manufacturing activities through the exchange itself. This was not barter between neighbors. This was a system, an infrastructure. We are speaking of the world's first documented network of merchant intermediaries, not anomalies, memories. Excavations at sites like Shari Sokhter in eastern Iran have uncovered the workshops where this transformation happened. The cut of a groove with a microblade, the same motion our Sumerian craftsman makes at his bench, was the characteristic step in working lapis lazuli in these Iranian centers. They separated the purest fractions from the raw blocks. They shaped the cylindrical beads. They managed the stages of perforation. This was specialized craft production, centuries before what our conventional timeline tends to celebrate as the dawn of sophisticated commerce. And then there is the road itself. Archaeologists, reconstructing the route from terrain analysis and archaeological remains, have determined it likely followed this path as the landscape would have dictated, from the Afghan highlands, through Khorasan, through settlements at Hisar and Kum and Saveh and Hamadan, through Kermanshah, westward to the gateway at Gasser-e-Shirin, and onward into Mesopotamia. The archaeological evidence of lapis lazuli found along this route is, researchers note, conclusive. The route is real. It is traceable in stone and sediment and the chemistry of ancient refuse pits. This route would later be called the Great Khorasan Road. It would function as a major artery in the Silk Road trade after the beginning of the Common Era, but the Silk Road did not build it. The Silk Road found it already there. already worn by centuries of use, already known. The earth remembers. Even when we forget, the stone holds the memory. Consider what administrative tablets from Sumer tell us. Between 2300 and 1800 BCE, these clay records, pressed into permanence by the same impulse that drives us to write things down, the terror of forgetting, document maritime trade arriving from Dilmun, from Magan, from Meluha, through the Persian Gulf. Ships berthing in the ports near Ur, sometimes travelling deep inland to the river ports of Agade. And separately, the archaeological record confirms that lapis lazuli moved through both overland and maritime networks simultaneously, the same precious stone flowing by multiple routes at once through the Arabian Sea, through the Persian Gulf ports, arriving finally at the cities of the two rivers, by land and by sea, simultaneously, for centuries. This is not the behavior of a primitive economy taking its first tentative steps toward exchange. This is a mature system, one that had already solved the hard problems: how to guarantee supply across distances you cannot police, how to establish trust with partners you will never see, how to price a commodity that has no local equivalent against ones that do. Around the 14th century BCE, merchants operating between Egypt and Mesopotamia, such as those based in the trading city of Ugarit, were already exploiting arbitrage between gold and silver markets, buying in one market, selling in another, pocketing the difference. The logic of the trader, in other words, is very old, older than the road we named for silk, older than the empire that built its first paved stretches. We tend to date the Silk Road's origins to Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, to the 2nd century BCE. And that story is true, but it is not the beginning. It is merely a recent chapter in a far older telling. The beginning is a craftsman in a Sumerian workshop, pressing a microblade into vivid blue stone. The beginning is a merchant on the Iranian plateau, acquiring raw lapis from a trader who acquired it from someone else, who acquired it from the Afghan valley where it was pulled from the earth. The beginning is the recognition, made not in language but in action, in trade, in the willingness to walk 1,200 miles for the right stone, that the world is larger than what you can see from where you stand, and that the rare thing, the beautiful thing, the thing the gods demand for their temples and the kings demand for their graves, is worth the crossing. The Silk Road did not create that recognition. It inherited it from people who pressed blue dust from their hands 10,000 years before the first bolt of Chinese silk unfurled onto a merchant's scale. The impulse is ancient. The road is just the latest version of it. And sometimes, beneath the road, the earth keeps its own records, pressed not into stone, but into flesh and fibre and the cold, dry dark. The wool was not large enough to cover her feet. That detail, small and almost domestic, is the first thing that strikes you when you read the accounts. A woman, buried 3 feet beneath the floor of the Taklamakan desert near a place called Lop Nur, wrapped in 2 pieces of woven cloth that someone had laid across her body with care. Someone had tried, and still her ankles were left bare to the salt and the cold, dry air that would preserve her for the next 4,000 years. She had crossed no distance we can measure, left no record of trade, no name pressed into clay. And yet, there she was, waiting in the dark, beneath a road that would not yet exist for 2 millennia, carrying a question the road itself could not answer. Chinese archaeologists found her in 1980, working on a documentary about the Silk Road, a road that would not be formally named as a concept for another 1900 years after her death. Her hair still held colour, her features were still distinct, and those features were, by every account of those who uncovered her, startling. Not because mummies in the Chinese interior are unusual, not because her burial was extraordinary, but because she looked nothing like what the official story of this place had ever predicted or prepared anyone to find. She looked European. The archaeologists named her the Beauty of Loulan. She's been dated to approximately 1800 BCE, roughly 1600 years before the formal Silk Road networks would be consolidated under the Han Dynasty, and nearly 1900 years before the German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen would coin the term Silk Road in 1877. Before Emperor Wu seized control of the Hexi corridor and inadvertently founded the road that would carry his empire's name westward, she was already there, already buried, already gone, her wool too small for her body, her ankles bare, and she was not alone. The story grows wider. The Tarim Basin, that vast inland depression in what is now Xinjiang in western China, has yielded mummy after mummy over the decades, dozens of them, preserved with uncanny perfection by the same dry salt air that stripped Lop Nur of its water and its life. Scholars call them the best surviving record of ancient North Eurasian populations we have, and the evidence is stark. Light hair where the historical record had promised none, tall stature, woven wool textiles of a complexity that implies generations of accumulated craft knowledge, funerary gifts placed beside them with the deliberate care of a people who believed deeply that the dead were going somewhere. They are disorienting. That is the word that keeps appearing in the accounts of researchers who encounter them for the first time. Disorienting. Because the Tarim Basin is in western China, because conventional history told us this region was essentially empty or sparsely populated by people who left no mark of consequence until the great civilizational machinery of the Han Dynasty rolled westward and created something. Created connection, created trade, created the Silk Road. It didn't explain the wool, it didn't explain the hair, and it didn't explain why a population of people with strikingly European physical features had been living, dying, and burying their dead at the crossroads of East and West for centuries, perhaps millennia, before any official history decided to notice them. The genetic evidence, when it finally came, complicated the tidy narrative considerably. In work published by Zhang and colleagues in 2025, researchers examined a late Bronze Age site in the far western Tarim Basin, dated between 1600 and 1400 BCE. What they found, encoded in ancient DNA, was that the inhabitants of those sites were overwhelmingly descended from populations with ancestry associated with the Sintashta and Andronovo cultures, steppe people, from the vast grasslands that roll across what is now Russia and Kazakhstan, west of the Urals and north of the Caspian Sea. 10% from the BMAC, the Bronze Age civilization of Bactria and Margiana in what is now Turkmenistan and Afghanistan. 12% from an even older local strain, a population researchers call Tarim EMBA, people who had been there before those with steppe ancestry arrived, all of it mixing in the salt. Think about what that means. People with ancestry from Eurasian steppe populations, people from the Oasis civilizations of Central Asia, people from an even older, partially unknown population rooted in the Tarim Basin itself, all of them converging, all of them mixing or choosing not to mix, living beside each other, burying their dead in the salt. In the far western end of what would one day be called the Silk Road, in 1600 BCE, the pattern that emerges across the evidence, across the millennia, across the bones and the textiles and the funerary gifts, suggests something the conventional timeline resists acknowledging. The formal Silk Road networks drew upon roots and connections that were far older than the empires that formalized them. The connections were not invented, they were inherited. But the Tarim mummies do not fit comfortably into any national story, not the Chinese national story, not the Western story of a civilization radiating outward from the Mediterranean, not any story with clean borders and rightful owners. And this is where the temperature rises. The mummies complicate whatever story any empire might wish to tell about this region. They complicate it not from malice, not from ideology, but simply from the stubborn physical fact of their existence. Their bones carry the memory of a steppe migration that had nothing to do with the Han dynasty. Their DNA is a document that predates the documents. The desert preserves what people would prefer to let dissolve. Here is what we know. Here is what the evidence says, quietly and without agenda. By the time of the late Iron Age, as the cities of the western Tarim Basin became cosmopolitan hubs of trade and culture and movement, the Andronovo-related ancestry that had once dominated the region is no longer detectable. It has been absorbed, folded into something new, something more complex, something that looks like the beginning of what we would recognize as the Silk Road world. The steppe people did not persist as a distinct population. They became part of the mix. They planted their cultures like seeds and then disappeared into the soil they had changed. What does it mean that these people were there first? What does it mean that the crossroads of East and West was occupied, was inhabited, was already a place of convergence, long before any empire drew a line through it and called it a road? The Beauty of Loulan was buried 3 feet below ground, wrapped in wool too small for her body, surrounded by gifts from the people who loved her. She was there in 1800 BCE, and she was there in 1980 when Chinese archaeologists found her, and she is there now in the Xinjiang Museum in Urumqi, behind glass, her face still carrying its original structure. She does not belong to any single nation's story. She belongs to a story older than nations, the story of a world that was always more connected than we were taught, of a road that was never just a road, of a crossroads that was already ancient when the historians arrived to name it. She was there before the name, before the empire, before the tidy line on the map, and somewhere, carved into stone faces we have barely begun to read, others were there too, waiting, as she waited, for us to understand what they were trying to tell us. The words are still there, cut into rock, not in a museum, not behind glass, but pressed into the living stone of a mountain pass in northern Pakistan, a corridor so narrow that the cliffs lean in on either side like the walls of a hallway, the Karakoram, the place where the subcontinent grinds against the spine of Central Asia and the rock buckles upward toward the sky. Travelers have moved through this passage for 2,000 years, carrying wool and glass and lapis lazuli and silk, moving in both directions, always moving. And they left something behind, not coins, not foundations, not the ruins that archaeologists dig up in the desert. They left words, cut directly into the rock face, inscriptions in a script that most people today have never heard of, in a language that almost no one alive can read without years of specialized training. Sogdian. Say that word to most people, and you will get nothing back, a blank. And yet the Sogdians were, for 5 centuries, the beating operational heart of the most important trade network in human history. They ran the Silk Road, not Chinese emperors, not Roman senators, not the great dynasties whose names fill the history books. A network of Iranian-origin merchants from the region near what is today Samarkand, that ancient city in modern Uzbekistan, straddling the line where southern Uzbekistan meets western Tajikistan, built a diaspora so extensive, so deeply embedded in the commerce and culture of Eurasia, that the Silk Road, as we understand it, is largely their creation. And almost no one has heard of them. The pattern repeats. The people who actually move history, the translators, the middlemen, the merchants who sleep in desert watchtowers and carve their names into cliffs because there is nothing else to mark their passing, are the people the official record forgets. History is written by the empires. The Sogdians had no empire. What they had was something more durable, a network. Their core territory was the region the ancient world called Sogdiana, a fertile agricultural zone centered on the Zarafshan River Valley, the land around Samarkand and Bukhara, the oasis cities that sit at the geographic crossroads of everything. From this base, the network expanded. Sogdian merchants fanned outward across Eurasia from at least the early 4th century through the 9th century of the Common Era.
Chinese chronicles of the Tang dynasty noted their commercial acumen, which is a polite way of saying that the Chinese recognized the Sogdians as the most capable traders they had ever encountered. Sogdian colonies appeared deep inside China. Sogdian merchants established themselves in the capital. Some rose to serve as administrators. Their language, a Middle Iranian tongue that had evolved into something flexible, practical, and extraordinarily well adapted to the needs of long-distance communication, became the working language of the Silk Road itself. The Sogdian language was the merchant tongue, not by decree, by necessity. Consider what that means. A language becomes a lingua franca not through military conquest, not through the ambitions of courts or emperors. The Sogdian language spread because the Sogdians were everywhere. Everyone who traded with them had to speak to them. No choice, no alternative. The language followed the merchants, and the merchants followed the routes, and the routes followed the water, the oases, the river valleys, the mountain passes where the rock faces are still covered in their words. Their reach was staggering. Sogdian inscriptions have been found carved into remote rock faces in the mountain valleys of northern Pakistan, signatures left along the routes that cut through the Karakoram. They were not monuments, they were not temples. They were the equivalent of a merchant pressing a thumb into wet clay and saying, "I was here, I came through this pass, I survived this mountain." These inscriptions, in a place no tourist will ever visit, in a place that requires a degree of physical determination simply to reach, are the signatures of a world that has been almost entirely lost. But then, in 1907, the British archaeologist Aurel Stein was excavating a Chinese watchtower in the desert some 90 kilometers west of Dunhuang, in the vicinity of the Jade Gate, the fortified outpost that guarded the western approaches to that great oasis city, and he found something that should not, by any ordinary logic of survival, still exist. 5 letters, nearly complete, written in Sogdian on paper so thin you could see light through it, discovered in that tower in circumstances that suggest they were abandoned or sealed away during a moment of political upheaval, buried under centuries of sand and the specific indifference of the Gobi Desert. The letters were dated by subsequent analysis to approximately 313 or 314 of the Common Era. Some of these letters were commercial in nature, dispatches between merchants, reports on market conditions, notes about cloth and whether certain goods were moving. One of them described, with a flat, almost journalistic calm, the catastrophe then unfolding in China. The Xiongnu had sacked Luoyang. The Chinese emperor had fled. The letter writer reported this the way a modern trader might report a supply chain disruption. The world was ending, more or less, and the merchants needed to know. 2 of the letters were written by a woman in distress who had been abandoned in Dunhuang, calling for help in circumstances the brief record does not fully explain. She wrote asking for rescue. She wrote a second time. The letters were never delivered. They sat in that watchtower for 1600 years. The earth remembers. Even when the people have vanished, the sand keeps their letters. Now hold this image alongside another, smaller, and perhaps even more quietly extraordinary. At the ancient oasis of Khotan, an important town along the southern route of the Silk Road just before it crosses the Pamir Mountains, 3 inscribed seals were discovered during Stein's excavations. 3 small objects, not architecture, not treasure, just seals, the kind a merchant or official would press into wax or clay to authorize a document, to mark a transaction, to say, "This is mine, this came from me, I stand behind this." The first seal carried a Persian inscription. The second was Sogdian, bearing a Pahlavi text that translates, with a certain theatrical formality, as, "by 1,000 times 10,000 genuflections." The third was inscribed in Brahmi script, the script of India, and bore the Sanskrit name Sarvashriya, meaning something close to "he who is rich in all things." 3 seals, 3 scripts,
three distinct cultural worlds, all found together at a single oasis town on the edge of the Taklamakan Desert. According to the scholar Janos Harmata, who examined these objects, they represent invaluable historical sources for the history of the Silk Road and the intercultural contacts between East and West. That framing is technically correct and somehow entirely insufficient. What those three seals represent is something more vertiginous. A Persian merchant, a Sogdian trader, and an Indian businessman all conducting their affairs at the same crossroads, each carrying the paperwork of a different civilization, none of them surprised by the other's presence. This was not anomalous. This was Tuesday at Khotan. The Sogdians were not just traders in silk or glass or horses, though they traded in all of those things. They were translators of goods, of ideas, of scripture. When Buddhism moved from India into China, it traveled along the Silk Road, and the Sogdians were among the people who carried it. They did not merely move the texts, they translated them. Sogdian Buddhists became key intermediaries in the transmission of an entire spiritual tradition from one civilization to another. The religion that would eventually transform East Asian culture arrived in part through the hands of Iranian merchants who had no particular cultural stake in it beyond the work itself. This is what the conventional history leaves out. It tells the story of the Silk Road as if it were the story of China and Rome, the great empires at either end, their courts and their treasuries and their armies. But the people in the middle, the people who actually walked the routes and slept in the caravanserais and carved their names into mountain rock, those people were not Chinese and they were not Roman. They were stateless, or effectively so. They belonged to a diaspora that had no army to defend it and no emperor to command it. Their power was not political, it was relational. They knew everyone. They spoke every language they needed to speak. They were trusted because they were everywhere, and they were everywhere because they were trusted. The question that should interest us is not why the Sogdians have been forgotten. The question is, what else we have forgotten along with them? What other figures walked those routes without permission, without official seal, without empire at their backs, and changed the world anyway? One of them had a name, a lone monk on horseback at the edge of the world. Behind him, the last watchtower of the Tang Empire, its mud-brick walls dissolving already into the shimmering heat. Ahead of him, nothing. Sky the color of bleached bone, sand that moved like something alive. The vast and pitiless throat of the Moheyanki Gobi Desert, stretching out beyond any horizon a man could hope to reach. The monk's name is Xuanzang. He is not supposed to be here. Travel beyond the empire's borders without official sanction was forbidden. There was no imperial permission, no official seal, no diplomatic escort. Only a Buddhist monk who had become obsessed with a question so large it could only be answered at the source. In 626 CE, Xuanzang had begun studying Sanskrit. He had come to the Yogacara school of Buddhist philosophy and found it incomplete. The texts available in China were partial, fragmented, copied from copies of copies, translated through languages that bent meaning like light through imperfect glass. He needed the original scriptures. He needed India. And so, with no permission and no guarantee of return, he crossed the border anyway, reaching the Moheyanki Gobi not as a diplomat or a merchant, but as something the empire had no category for. Sometime in 628 CE, a young monk alone in the most unforgiving terrain on earth, he almost died in the desert. The Moheyanki Gobi is not a desert you navigate. It is a desert that navigates you, that reduces you to a single animal calculation, water or nothing. Xuanzang experienced mirages, that particular cruelty of the deep desert, where the mind constructs the very thing it cannot have and places it just beyond reach. He was nearly out of water, he was nearly out of time, and then his horse did what horses sometimes know to do when the rider no longer can. The animal turned, found its own direction, carried the monk, the scrolls, the obsession, the future transmission of an entire philosophical tradition to an oasis he could not have found alone. The horse was thirsty. The horse found water. History turned. Think about what was riding on that horse. Not just a man, not just a library. What was riding on that horse was a chain of transmission that would eventually place Buddhist thought at the heart of Chinese civilization, that would change the art and architecture and inner life of an entire people for centuries to come. Xuanzang reached the first kingdom in his journey, Yiwu, which we would call Hami. He was greeted warmly at a temple there by a monk of his own Han people, an outpost of Chinese Buddhism already planted in the desert. But warmth was not always what waited for him down the road. In the spring of 628 CE, Xuanzang reached the third kingdom in his journey, Yanqi. He was not well received there and stayed only one night before moving on. The Silk Road was not a single experience. It was 1,000 different negotiations, 1,000 different receptions, conducted one oasis at a time. The kingdom of Gaochang is where the political architecture of the road becomes impossible to ignore. Gaochang sat astride the northern branch of the Silk Road, like a toll booth with an army. Its king had made a calculation that the merchants of the conventional timeline understand, but historians sometimes overlook. The Silk Road was not just a commercial artery, it was a geopolitical weapon. Control the road, and you controlled the flow of goods, intelligence and influence across the entire Eurasian landmass. The king of Gaochang had allied himself with the Turkic people against the Tang Empire for precisely this reason. The road was the prize, not silk, not spices, the road itself. Xuanzang passed through while that alliance still held, the king still living, the kingdom still intact. He made a promise to the king before he left, a promise he carried with him all the way to India and through the years of his return journey. Then, in 643 CE, preparing to climb the Pamir Plateau, Xuanzang stopped to speak with a merchant along the route. The merchant told him what the road had already moved on from. His sworn brother, the king of Gaochang, had died in his palace. The Tang cavalry had come. The kingdom had surrendered without a fight and been absorbed into the empire. Gone. When Xuanzang arrived home in 645 CE, there was nothing left of Gaochang to keep his promise to. The road had consumed it, and he had learned of its end the way most people learn of distant catastrophe, through hearsay, at a way station, from a stranger passing in the other direction. This is the pattern that repeats, if you trace it long enough. The Silk Road did not merely connect civilizations, it ground them together. Empires rose along its length, fed on its commerce, fought wars to control its mountain passes and desert oases, and when those empires fractured, the road remained, indifferent, patient, waiting for the next caravan, the next dynasty, the next monk, with a question too large for his own country to answer. Xuanzang's route took him along both the northern and southern branches of the road, through kingdoms whose names have mostly dissolved into scholarly footnotes. He braved bandits. At one point his group was waylaid, the bandits left after being paid, and the traders who came along the same road directly after Xuanzang's group were not so fortunate. They were all killed. He crossed mountain ranges that would have seemed, to anyone from the flat agricultural heartland of the Tang Empire, like monuments to a hostile god. He climbed, he descended. He followed the road through its 1,000 different expressions of the same basic human enterprise. Someone, somewhere, needs something that someone else has. But here is what the conventional history misses, every time, with its trade tonnages and its commodity lists. Xuanzang was not carrying goods. He was carrying a civilization in his head. Consider what that means. In 643 CE, preparing to climb the Pamir Plateau on his return journey, Xuanzang became the first person to describe that forbidding upland world in writing, not the first to cross it. Caravans had been crossing the Pamirs for centuries by then, their cart tracks pressed into the high passes, their dead buried along the routes in graves that archaeology has only lately begun to find. But Xuanzang was the first to stop and write it down. To look at a mountain plateau so vast and so cold and so indifferent to human survival, and to say, this exists, and here is what it is like to stand inside it. That act of description is itself a form of transmission. The road didn't just carry goods and religions and diseases and the occasional court musician, it carried ways of seeing. Xuanzang's account of the lands he crossed would inform Chinese understanding of the Western world for generations. His descriptions of kingdoms, peoples, distances, and terrain were precise enough that scholars would still be consulting them more than 1,000 years later, using his measurements in units called li to map the geography of a world that had long since reshaped itself beyond recognition. He returned to Tang China in 645 CE, carrying many Sanskrit manuscripts. The emperor who had forbidden his departure was so impressed by what he brought back that he commissioned a formal account of the journey. Xuanzang spent the rest of his life translating those texts, producing a body of work that seeded the Yogacara tradition into Chinese Buddhism with a depth and precision that the fragmentary earlier translations could never achieve. What traveled the Silk Road was not primarily silk, not primarily spices, not lapis lazuli shipped from the mines of Afghanistan through 1,000 intermediary hands to decorate the temples of Mesopotamia, not the bolts of fabric that gave the road its modern name, a name that wasn't even coined until a German geographer, Ferdinand von Richthofen, invented it in the late 19th century, long after the road had gone quiet, a retrospective naming of something that had moved history without ever needing a name. The road had been still for centuries before anyone thought to call it anything. What travelled the road was this: a monk on a horse in a desert, chasing a question, and behind him and before him and stretching in all directions across the centuries, 1,000 other pilgrims carrying other questions, other texts, other songs, other gods, pressing them like seeds into the soil of every culture they passed through. The road changed history not because of what it moved, but because of what it planted. The stones remember. The manuscripts, when they survived, remember even more. And tucked into the desert at the far western edge of the Tang Empire, sealed into a cave sometime around the year 1000, 10,000 of those manuscripts were waiting in the dark for someone to find them. They waited 900 years, in perfect darkness, for a single lantern to find them. Light first, then the story. A single lantern carried by a former soldier turned wandering monk, its flame casting orange warmth across a wall of packed darkness. The room is barely the size of a utility cupboard. The air that rushes out has not moved in 9 centuries, and there, pressed against every surface from floor to ceiling, stacked and bundled and folded into every available space, is paper, ancient paper, scrolls and manuscripts and paintings, thousands upon thousands of them, the dust of a dead world hanging suspended in that desert light, the same light, in some sense, that monks had been carrying across these sands for 1,000 years. Wang Yuanlu found it in 1900. The cave had been remembering for 900 years. Let us begin at the beginning. Sometime in the 3rd century CE, a wandering monk named Lei Zun was crossing the desert near the oasis town of Dunhuang. He was, by any practical measure, nobody, an itinerant, a pilgrim, a man with no city and no patron. And then, on the windswept slopes of a mountain called Mingsha, he had a vision. Across the mountain's sides he saw 1,000 Buddhas blazing in full radiance. The light of it stopped him where he stood. He did not move on. Instead, he did the only thing that made sense to a man who had just seen the sacred written across an entire mountain. He carved a small cave into the rock, a single niche for meditation, a place to hold the vision. That was the beginning. Over the next 1,000 years, pilgrims, patrons, and artisans arrived in waves, carving over 735 grottos into the cliffside. Some were small niches, barely large enough to sit in. Others were substantial excavations as large as country churches. their walls covered floor to ceiling with frescoes in colors that still burn after 15 centuries. Indian influences came first, carried along the roads from Afghanistan. Chinese styles followed. 20th century excavations of the site uncovered one statue that is distinctly Hellenic. The current scholarly thinking holds it to be the work of a sculptor from Balkh in Afghanistan, where Greek cultural influence had taken deep root after Alexander's campaigns. The Mogao grottos of Dunhuang became what the Silk Road itself had always been, a place where the world met itself and left a mark. And then there is Cave 17. You would walk past it without knowing. It opens from the wall of Cave 16, low and unassuming, its mouth sealed for 900 years behind a layer of plastered stone. Wang Yuanlu, an itinerant monk and former Qing soldier who had appointed himself custodian of the caves, was digging sand from the entrance of Cave 16 in the year 1900 when he felt something give. A chunk of plaster dislodged. The wall behind it was hollow. Wang brought his light closer. When the dust cleared, he found himself staring at a solid mass of ancient paper. He did not, at first, understand what he had found. Nobody would. Not fully. Not for years. Not even now. What Wang had stumbled into was nothing less than a library, but not a library in any sense we would recognize. Not a collection curated by a single tradition or a single language or a single civilizational project. What had been pressed into that small dark room was the entire living memory of the Silk Road world in all its promiscuous, multilingual, miraculous complexity. The manuscripts are written in 9 documented languages, Chinese, of course, because this was a Chinese oasis town and these were Chinese caves, but also Tibetan, because Tibetan forces controlled Dunhuang for long stretches of the medieval period. Also Khotanese, the language of the Buddhist kingdom of Khotan to the west, carried there by merchants and monks along the southern branch of the route. Also Sogdian, the language of those Iranian traders who served as the nervous system of the entire corridor for 5 centuries, whose colonies stretched from Samarkand to the edge of the Chinese heartland. Also Old Uyghur and Old Turkic, pressed into the cave by communities we barely know existed. Also Sanskrit, the sacred language of the Buddhist texts that had traveled this road for 1,000 years before the cave was sealed. Also Tangut and Kuchean, 9 languages, 9 worlds, speaking out of the same dark room. Here is what that means. The standard historical record, the grand narratives produced by empires, compiled by scholars, approved by courts, was written in the language of whoever held power. It told the story that power wanted told. It explained how taxes should be collected, how borders should be maintained, how dynasties rose and fell in patterns that justified the dynasty currently in power. The Dunhuang manuscripts are something else entirely. They came together by accident, not design. Unlike the official record, no single authority curated Cave 17. What ended up there was the actual texture of life along the Silk Road. The manuscripts reveal how land was measured, recorded and taxed, showing how practice diverged from the proclamations of distant emperors. Non-canonical religious texts, works belonging to banned movements that appear nowhere else in the historical record, private letters, biographies, military histories. The official record explains how the world was supposed to work. Cave 17 shows how it actually did. And yet, we cannot tell you why it was sealed. This is the mystery the scholars cannot resolve. Responsible researchers have proposed 6 different explanations, each with evidence, none decisive. Perhaps it was a geniza, a repository for sacred waste, texts too holy to destroy, but no longer fit for use, walled up as a form of reverent disposal. Perhaps the monks sealed it in fear of invasion, protecting what they treasured most before raiders arrived. Perhaps it was intended to survive a period of religious decay, a time capsule meant to outlast whatever calamity was coming. Perhaps it was simply the relocation of a single monastic library that was never fully reclaimed. We may never know. The cave does not say. It only holds what it was given and waits. What it was given is staggering. Dunhuang sat at the intersection of four great cultural spheres. Chinese civilization lay to the east, Tibetan to the south, the Central Asian steppe to the north, and the long corridor of oasis towns stretched west toward Persia and beyond. Every tradition that passed through left something. Christianity is in those caves. Manichaeism is in those caves. Buddhism in more forms than most modern practitioners would recognize. Taoism in texts that do not exist anywhere else. The Silk Road did not merely carry goods between China and the West. It carried everything people believed and feared and hoped and disputed, and Dunhuang was where all of it collected, decade by decade, century by century, until one day someone decided to wall it up and walk away. 900 years of silence followed. The road withered. The oasis sank into obscurity. The desert drifted over the grottos. And inside Cave 17, stacked in the dark, the manuscripts waited. This is the thing about the Silk Road that the conventional account has never fully grasped. It is not, at its core, a story about trade, not about silk or lapis lazuli or spices or horses. Those things moved along the routes, yes. They matter, yes. But what the routes actually carried, what made them transformative across 2,000 years of human history, was something that cannot be weighed or taxed. It was knowledge, language, sacred text, heresy. The news that your city had fallen to the Huns, scratched onto a letter that was never delivered and ended up buried in a watchtower for 16 centuries. The record of a property dispute between farmers who did not know they were living through history. A fragment of a prayer in a language almost nobody alive can read. The cave is not a footnote to the story of the Silk Road. The cave is the story. The official histories tell us what empires did. Cave 17 tells us what people believed, borrowed, translated, argued about, and chose to preserve when they believed the world was ending. That is a different kind of record, and it is, in almost every way that matters, a more honest one. The Silk Road was one of the least travelled routes in human history, according to Yale historian Valerie Hansen, if you measure it by tonnage or traffic. Most people never set foot on it. Most merchants handed their goods to intermediaries after a few hundred miles and turned back home. The caravans of popular imagination, endless trains of camels crossing the desert from Rome to China, largely did not exist. What existed instead was a series of relays, each one short, each one local, adding up across centuries to something vast and world-changing. And the change was never in the goods. It was in what the goods carried with them. A Buddhist text arrives in China. A Sogdian merchant builds a colony in a Chinese city and teaches his children to read both Sogdian and Chinese. A sculptor trained in the Greek tradition of Balkh carves a statue that ends up in a Buddhist cave near the Taklamakan's edge, where it waits to be excavated centuries later by archaeologists who recognize the posture immediately. The pattern repeats. The knowledge moves. And when the knowledge cannot move any further, when the road closes and the empire falls and the invaders are at the gates, someone wraps it carefully in cloth, stacks it against the walls of a small sealed room, and leaves it for a world that does not yet exist, a world that will come. Centuries later, in the cold desert dark, with camels and crates. And take it, picture it, the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, sometime in the spring of 1907. Night. The air is cold in the way desert air gets cold after dark, sharp and mineral, carrying the smell of sand and something older. Aurel Stein, a British archaeologist of Hungarian birth working on behalf of the Indian government, is loading those crates onto camels outside a small niche cut into the sandstone cliff face. The niche is barely bigger than a utility cupboard. Inside it, until very recently, had been stacked a collection of manuscripts so dense and so old that it amounted to, in a very real sense, the memory of a civilization.
Someone had wrapped it carefully, stacked it against the walls, left it. And here, at last, was the world it had been left for. Stein is taking that memory, loading it onto animals, moving it into the dark, and somewhere nearby, watching from the shadows, is a man named Wang Yuanlu. Wang was a wandering monk, reportedly a former soldier of the Qing dynasty, a man who had appointed himself caretaker of the Mogao grottos outside Dunhuang when almost no one else thought the job worth doing. He had discovered the manuscripts himself 7 years earlier. In 1900, digging sand from the entrance of one of the caves, he had dislodged a chunk of plaster from the wall. When the dust settled, he found himself staring into a room packed floor to ceiling with ancient paper. 900 years it had waited, 900 years sealed in the dark, while the Silk Road died around it, while Dunhuang shrank from a vital oasis into an afterthought at the edge of an empire that had forgotten it existed. And then Wang's shovel touched plaster, and the room breathed again. What happened next is one of the great movements of manuscripts in history, quiet, administrative, the kind wrapped in politeness and hard currency. Stein came first in 1907 on behalf of the British. He negotiated access to the cave with Wang and departed with what the record describes as one of the greatest archaeological hauls in history. Then came Paul Pelliot, a French scholar renowned for his command of classical Chinese, who spent weeks inside the cave selecting manuscripts, choosing, by some accounts, the finest and rarest, the ones that required genuine scholarly expertise to recognize as precious. He left with his own crates. Then Sergei Oldenburg came for Russia, then a private Japanese expedition. Between 1907 and 1915, foreign teams carried off as many as 46,000 manuscripts from across the Dunhuang site. 46,000. Roughly 14,000 documents remained in China, a fraction of what had once been whole. Peter Hopkirk, who chronicled the whole extraordinary episode, called these expeditions what they were: long-range archaeological raids. The phrase carries weight: not explorations, not discoveries, raids. And here is what makes the wound so precise, so surgical. Stein and Pelliot and the rest were not vandals. They were not smashing things. They were scholars, careful and meticulous, men who understood exactly what they were carrying away. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. The acquisition was made by people who knew precisely what they were acquiring. Consider the scale of what was in that cave. The Dunhuang manuscripts are not a single archive. They are the accumulated textual residue of centuries of Silk Road life, centuries of it, layers, written in Chinese, Tibetan, Sogdian, Sanskrit, Old Uyghur, Khotanese, Old Turkic, Tangut, Kuchean, and more, pressed into paper and silk and wood. Not just scripture, though there was scripture in abundance. Buddhist texts, yes, but also Manichaean texts, Taoist texts, Nestorian Christian texts. Documents that show how land was measured and taxed, how populations were counted, how local practice diverged from imperial proclamation. Biographies, military histories, letters never sent, songs, calendars, contract disputes, the texture of actual life along the road in a dozen languages, from a dozen cultures, over hundreds of years. The standard Chinese historical record was produced by professionals writing to teach lessons to those in power. The Dunhuang collection, the manuscripts, the texts, all of it, came together by accident. It was the Silk Road's own archive of itself. The things it remembered were the things official history forgot, and now it is everywhere, and therefore, in one important sense, nowhere. To see the best of what Dunhuang held, you would have to travel across continents, from Gansu to London, Paris, Berlin, Moscow, Tokyo, and beyond. The British Museum holds its portion. The Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris holds Pelliot's selection, the cream of what a scholar's trained eye decided was worth taking. The Asiatic,
Museum in St. Petersburg holds the Russian share, the rest scattered further still. The collection that Dunhuang held together, that the sealed cave preserved intact for 9 centuries, has now been dispersed across cities on 4 continents, indexed in catalogues written in the languages of the empires that took it. And here the question becomes one. The manuscripts themselves cannot escape. Bitterness, irony. To whose history do they belong? The question is not simple. The Dunhuang manuscripts contain texts from 4 of the great cultural spheres that met and overlapped at that particular corner of the world. Chinese, yes, but also Tibetan, Central Asian, Indian. Texts in Sogdian, the language of those great Iranian merchants who were, for centuries, the nervous system of Silk Road commerce, whose language became a common tongue for communication along thousands of miles of trade route. The cave at Dunhuang sat at the nexus of these worlds. It was not purely Chinese, it was not purely Buddhist. It was the record of a crossing, a meeting, a centuries-long conversation between peoples who would not have agreed on who owned it. And then representatives of the British Empire came, negotiated with a Qing dynasty monk, loaded the conversation onto camels, and took it to London. Then France took its share. Then Russia. It is worth noting that the manuscripts themselves include, among their thousands of items, some of the earliest known examples of Sogdian writing in the world. Letters written by merchants describing the fall of cities, the abandonment of trading partners, the chaos of collapsing Chinese dynasties. Dispatches from people who were themselves moving along the road, carrying goods and information between worlds. The Silk Road's own documents about the Silk Road, now sitting in reading rooms in European capitals, requiring institutional access and academic credentials to see. The pattern repeats. It always does. Knowledge travels along the roads until empires decide they want it housed somewhere they control. There is a final irony that the story cannot escape. The cave at Dunhuang survived for 900 years because someone sealed it, for reasons we still do not fully understand. Perhaps to protect the texts from invaders, perhaps as a repository for sacred waste, perhaps as a memorial to a holy man. Whatever the reason, the sealing worked. The dry desert air worked. The obscurity of a forgotten oasis worked. What 9 centuries of war and weather and the slow, grinding death of the Silk Road could not destroy, the arrival of European scholarship undid in 8 years. The collection that celebrated exchange was scattered by empire. The archive that documented centuries of cultural conversation was divided by the very impulse that conversation was supposed to transcend. The manuscripts speak Chinese and Tibetan and Sogdian and Sanskrit. They remember a world where those languages passed through the same city, pressed into the same paper, stored in the same cave. And today, to read them whole, you must hold a passport and know which archive to petition in which language. Wang Yuanlu watched from the shadows as Stein loaded those camels. He had been bribed, yes. He was complicit, yes. But he was also a man watching something leave that he understood he would not get back. Not all the 14,000 manuscripts that stayed in China could reassemble what had been whole. The cave remembers the absence now, and somewhere in that absence, scattered across the reading rooms of 3 empires, a woman is still waiting to be found. Imagine that reading room, London, or Paris, or St. Petersburg. It doesn't matter which. The light is controlled, the humidity monitored. White-gloved hands place a document on a surface designed to receive it. The paper is aged the color of weak tea, the ink slightly faded, but still legible after 1700 years in a sealed cave at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert. And there, in a script that takes specialist training to decipher, a woman is asking for help. She has been abandoned. She is in Dunhuang, a city at the far edge of everything she knew. She is in poverty, and she is writing in what scholars now call Sogdian to whoever might come for her. She is asking to be found. This is what the official histories do not contain.
For thousands of years, history was a professional project. Scribes sat, scholars recorded, court officials transcribed, and they wrote down only what mattered to power. They recorded the actions of emperors, they catalogued military campaigns and the rise and fall of noble houses. They codified laws, transcribed proclamations, memorialized the men who made decisions that moved armies and populations like pieces on a board. The Chinese historical tradition in particular was extraordinarily rigorous and sustained. The records of the grand historian, the history of the Han dynasty, the records of the three kingdoms, massive works of scholarship, preserved and copied and printed across millennia, teaching lessons to those in power about what power meant and what it cost. None of it told you what a woman stranded at the edge of the world was afraid of. What those histories do not tell you, what the official record was never designed to preserve, is the texture of life below the proclamations. It didn't tell you how much a cartload of grain actually cost in a given season in a given oasis town. It didn't show you whether a local tax collector's measurements matched the ones in the imperial edicts, or whether the Buddhist congregation in the next valley had quietly developed practices the central authorities would have banned. It didn't preserve the letter that was never sent, the contract that had already been settled, the words of a woman stranded 1,000 miles from home and writing into silence. The Dunhuang cave changed that. Sometime in the early 11th century, an enormous collection of manuscripts accumulated over generations was sealed inside a small niche in the Mogao grottos, just outside the oasis town of Dunhuang at the western end of the Hexi corridor. Why they were sealed there remains genuinely contested, perhaps to protect them from invaders, perhaps as a kind of sacred storage for worn-out holy texts, perhaps for reasons we will never fully reconstruct. They waited. Dunhuang faded. The Silk Road withered. The cave was forgotten. And then, in 1900, a self-appointed guardian of the grottos named Wang Yuanlu was clearing sand from an entrance passage, and a chunk of plaster gave way, and he found himself looking at a solid mass of ancient paper. What followed was, depending on your perspective, either the greatest archival recovery in human history or a catastrophic act of colonial looting, and it was both. Between 1907 and 1915, Wang was approached by representatives of Britain, France and Russia, each bearing hard cash, and a private non-governmental expedition from Japan arrived as well, the expeditions overlapping, competing, converging on this one small cave at the edge of the desert. Together, they carried off approximately 46,000 manuscripts. The British collections went to the British Museum, the French to the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the Russian materials to St. Petersburg. Another 14,000 remained in China. Together, they constitute the Dunhuang corpus, and what the corpus contains is something that no deliberately assembled library would ever have contained. It contains everything, not the curated everything of official scholarship, not the carefully selected texts that were deemed worthy of transmission to future generations by the professionals who maintained the imperial record. This collection came together the way life comes together, haphazardly, locally, accidentally. Someone needed to store something. Someone had a document that needed to be preserved. Someone left behind a letter that was never sent, or a contract that had already been settled, or a religious text that had been copied by a hand practicing its brushwork. The Dunhuang corpus is a cross-section of a living civilization at a particular moment in time, the kind of cross-section that official history actively destroys. Medieval versions of the records of the grand historian are in there. Yes, the standard histories survived and found their way into the cave along with everything else, but alongside them, non-standard versions, unknown works, biographies that contradict the received accounts, military histories that don't match the official narratives, and then beyond that, far beyond the edges of what official scholarship preserved, something stranger and more valuable, the documents of daily life, land contracts,
tax registers, population counts, household surveys, the actual granular record of how a small city at the edge of the desert actually functioned when the emperor's proclamations arrived and the local officials had to decide what to do with them. The standard histories tell you how property was supposed to be divided and how taxes were supposed to be collected. The Dunhuang documents show you what actually happened when the theory met the ground. Practice diverged from proclamation. It always does. The Dunhuang corpus is the record of that divergence, preserved in ink on paper in a sealed cave for 900 years. The languages alone tell the story of what the Silk Road actually was. Chinese, yes, but also Tibetan, Khotanese, Sogdian, Old Uyghur, Sanskrit, Tangut, and others still being catalogued and identified. Dunhuang sat at the intersection of four great cultural spheres: China, Tibet, Central Asia, the steppe, and its manuscripts reflect every one of them. Buddhism, Taoism, Manichaeism, and Christianity all appear in the documents. Local variations of religious practice that show up nowhere else in the historical record. Banned movements, heterodox texts copied out by hand and hidden in a cave because someone decided they were worth preserving, even if the authorities had decided they were not. These are not anomalies, they are memories. And then there is the woman, the Sogdian Ancient Letters, discovered in 1907 by the British archaeologist Aurel Stein in a Chinese watchtower some 90 kilometers west of Dunhuang, are the earliest substantial examples of Sogdian writing ever found. A collection of 5 nearly complete letters, written around the year 313 or 314, confiscated at a garrison on the edge of Chinese-controlled territory. 2 of them were written by a woman in distress who had been left behind in Dunhuang. The remaining 3 concern the commercial affairs of their authors. But it is those 2 letters that reach across the centuries with the most human urgency. She writes of poverty, of isolation, of the hope that someone, anyone, will come for her. She has been abandoned in a foreign city while the world continues its commerce around her. She is asking to be taken home. There is no record of whether she was. We don't know her fate. The official histories of the period don't mention her because she was not the kind of person the official histories recorded. She was a merchant's wife or companion, stranded at the far end of a trade route that had stopped working, writing in a language used widely for commerce along roads that connected Samarkand to the western approaches of China. She was a person. She was frightened. She put her words on paper and sealed them and gave them to someone who may have tried to carry them west through the passes, and the letter ended up confiscated by a Chinese garrison and sealed in a watchtower and found in the sand by a man with a shovel and a scholar's instinct, and read in a university translation project, and placed now before us. Across 1700 years, she is still speaking. This is what gets lost when we tell the history of the Silk Road as a story of silk and emperors and great powers negotiating access to the routes. The Silk Road was those things. It was also a woman in Dunhuang writing in Sogdian, frightened and alone. It was land surveyors whose measurements didn't match the proclamations. It was monks copying out texts that had been banned by authorities who would never see this particular cave. It was ordinary people living ordinary lives, leaving behind traces that the official record was never designed to capture. The cave held them all. The desert preserved them. And because someone sealed a door and someone else broke it open, we can hear them still. Paper carries the truest weight, but paper was not the only vessel. Across the mountains, in the permanent cold, something else had been waiting. The ice held the secret for 2,400 years. Deep in the Altai Mountains, on a windswept plateau where the borders of what is now Russia, Mongolia, and China converge, burial mounds rose from the permafrost like sentences pressed into the earth by a civilization that believed the dead still needed things. They needed horses, they needed wagons, They needed the finest cloth that the known world could produce. When excavators finally opened the burial mounds the Pazyryk people had built sometime in the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, they found exactly that. A man in a wooden coffin, his horse beside him, and wrapped around his body, silk, not rough-spun cloth, not local textile. Silk, whose weave and dye signature some researchers associate with workshops far to the east, in civilizations that, at that moment in history, the Altai world had no formal relationship with, no treaty, no diplomatic mission, no road with a name. The desert had kept one woman's frightened letter. The permafrost had kept this. Both had kept them perfectly, without permission, without any official record designed to hold them. The precise origin of that silk remains a subject of ongoing scholarly investigation, but the fact of its presence, in that mountain tomb, in that century, is not in dispute. The silk was there. Beside it, in the same frozen chambers, investigators found textiles and carpets of extraordinary complexity and wheeled vehicles, functional carts whose construction speaks to people who understood transport not as an occasional necessity, but as a way of life. Researchers from Altai University and the State Hermitage, working on Barrow 5, identified single-axled structures in an A-shaped triangular configuration with a transverse yoke designed to be pulled by 2 draft animals. The picture is still being assembled. New excavations continue to refine it, but the core finding is clear. These were not ceremonial objects, not symbolic gestures toward a distant life. They were machines for moving things across terrain that would defeat a camel caravan, machines for moving things across the roof of the world. This is what we are not told when we are given the standard account of the Silk Road. We are told about Han emperors. We are told about Roman appetite for Eastern luxury. We are told about the great cities at either end of the corridor, Chang'an glittering in the east, Rome gleaming in the west, and we are invited to imagine a thread of silk pulled taut between them, connecting 2 empires across a distance so vast it defies comprehension. But the Pazyryk burials predate the Han dynasty. They predate the formal Silk Road by centuries, and inside them sits evidence of connections reaching across the ancient world with a casualness that dismantles the standard picture entirely. The road was not built by empires. The road was already there. Scholars have begun to document this plainly, though the conventional historical narrative, built on centuries of emphasis on imperial actors, has been slow to shift. Historian Ravi K. Mishra argues that the role of nomadic peoples and steppe cultures has been systematically forgotten, that too much emphasis has been placed on the initiative of the Han dynasty and of Rome. Some scholars have taken this further, suggesting the sedentary empires at either end of Eurasia get the credit, while the illiterate nomadic pastoralists who lived in the vastness between them, who were, in fact, the connective tissue, the relay system, the living infrastructure through which goods and ideas actually moved, are footnotes, appendices, background, not anomalies, erasures. Consider what the steppe represented in the geography of the ancient world. It was not empty. It was not a void that goods somehow leaped across on their way from one empire to another. It was a world unto itself, vast and mobile and intricately organized, stretching from the Carpathians in the west to the borders of China in the east, a corridor of grass and wind and extraordinary human adaptation that made long-distance movement not merely possible, but routine. The steppe peoples moved in it the way fish move in water. They understood its rhythms, its seasonal patterns, its water sources, its mountain passes. They carried things. They traded things. They facilitated the movement of things between communities separated by distances that would have been incomprehensible to a Roman senator or a Tang dynasty bureaucrat sitting in a city. And they did this centuries before anyone coined a name for what they were doing. The evidence from the Pazyryk tombs is almost too clean to believe. Silk
and intricate textiles and wheeled vehicles, sealed in the same frozen chamber by the same culture, in the
4th century before the Common Era in the Altai Mountains, not fragments, not traces, intact goods preserved by ice, waiting for us to find them and understand what they meant. What they mean is this: the network existed before the empires named it. The connections existed before the diplomats formalized them. The trade existed before the merchants made it official. The Silk Road, or whatever we want to call the older, wider, wilder thing it grew from, was threaded together by people the empires could not fully see and would not have known how to control even if they could. Now consider how the road actually worked, even in its most organized period. The exchanges happened not in vast caravans, but in small relay transactions between neighboring communities, goods moving the way a whisper moves through a crowd, not one voice carrying a message from one end to the other. Hundreds of voices, each passing it a short distance, each handing it off. Small exchanges, local knowledge, the accumulated weight of countless ordinary interactions across an enormous space. Yale historian Valerie Hansen, who has spent years studying documents recovered from Oasis towns across Central Asia, has made exactly this argument, and it cuts against every romantic image of silk-laden caravans stretching to the horizon. And who made those relays possible? Who knew the terrain between Oasis towns? Who moved between the settled communities that could not move themselves? The nomads, the steppe peoples, the ones the standard history forgets. The pattern the conventional account describes: empire builds road, merchants travel road, goods move from civilization to civilization. That pattern has it backwards. The movement came first. The empires came later and tried to claim credit for what was already happening in the frozen highlands, in the grass corridors, in the mountain passes that no emperor had ever walked. They built walls and way stations and bureaucracies around a network that existed in the bodies and knowledge of people who had no interest in empires at all. The man in the Pazyryk coffin did not know about the Han dynasty. He did not know about Rome. He knew about the pass to the east, where silk could be obtained. He knew about the craftsmen to the south who wove textiles of extraordinary complexity. He knew about the distance between here and there, and he had the vehicles and the animals and the knowledge to traverse it. His world was not smaller than the world of the emperors. In certain crucial respects, it was larger. 2,400 years ago, while the great civilizations were still assembling themselves into the shapes we recognize, a man was buried in the Altai Mountains with a horse, a cart, and cloth that had likely begun its journey far to the east. The ice sealed the evidence. The ice kept the secret. We opened the tomb. We found the silk. We called it anomalous. It wasn't. It was the road, the original road, the one that didn't need an emperor's permission to exist and didn't wait for one before it began to move. What it did wait for, what it could not escape, was a name. Consider two maps. The first is faded at the edges, ink pressed into paper over a century old, hand-drawn by a German geologist named Baron Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877. Lines trace the ancient routes between China and Central Asia, and across them, in careful script, he has written a name that did not exist before that moment. The second map is glossy, printed in a dozen languages, distributed by a government infrastructure program to parliaments and press offices across the world. The lines are almost identical. The name is the same. 1,000 years of actual caravans, actual merchants, actual women writing desperate letters in dead languages, and two very different powers have looked at that same geography and seen, first and foremost, a story they could use. The pattern repeats. Von Richthofen was a scientist, a geologist, a man of measurement. He coined the term Seidenstraßen, silk roads, to describe the ancient trade networks linking China to the Mediterranean, and it was a reasonable shorthand, a cartographer's convenience. What he could not have anticipated was how completely the name would swallow the reality it described. The man in the ice had no name for what he was doing. He simply did it. Once you give something a name, you give it a shape. Once it has a shape, people begin to argue about who owns it. And so the Silk Road passed from von Richthofen's notebook into the diplomatic imagination of the world. UNESCO built a program around it. Researchers from dozens of countries convened under its banner. The phrase acquired the gravity of a historical fact rather than a modern label, which is a subtle but important transformation. A label invented in 1877 to describe routes that were never called Silk Roads by the people who walked them became the framework through which those people's lives are now interpreted. The trade on those routes was not primarily in silk. The roads were not roads in any modern sense. They were not one route, but many. And they did not, as Valerie Hansen of Yale has argued, carry particularly heavy traffic. Possibly not worth studying, she wrote provocatively, if tonnage or number of travellers were your only measures. What they carried instead was something harder to weigh: religion, language, disease, art, the seeds of things that took root 1,000 miles from where they were planted. But seeds are not as useful for statecraft as infrastructure. And so the name that von Richthofen invented passed through UNESCO's careful stewardship and arrived, in October 2013, at the Indonesian Parliament in Jakarta. President Xi Jinping stood before that assembly and proposed a 21st century maritime Silk Road connecting China to Europe, invoking an ancient legacy of connection, positioning China as both origin and heir of a civilizational network. It was, in its way, a beautiful speech. It was also a specific argument dressed in the clothing of history. The narrative that China's Belt and Road Initiative carries forward is one of Chinese centrality, Chinese ports, Chinese actors, Chinese goods radiating outward to a grateful world. It is a vision of the ancient trade network as something that originated in China, flowed through China, and derived its meaning from China. The countries in between are thoroughfares, connective tissue, grateful recipients of civilization and commerce. This version does not explain what actually happened along the maritime Silk Road, because what actually happened is that Southeast Asian port settlements were not passive waypoints at all. They were major trading nodes in their own right. Archaeological excavations in the Mekong Delta, on the Kra Isthmus, across the islands of Southeast Asia, have confirmed that local communities and chiefdoms formed their own trading circuits connecting the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea, from the very beginning of the current era. Spices from Southeast Asia, pepper and cinnamon especially, travelled west to Rome and north to China along networks that Southeast Asian traders built and maintained, not passengers on someone else's road, architects of the road itself. The Chinese BRI narrative ignores this, not out of accident, out of design. This is what happens when a network that belonged to no one is claimed by someone, and Southeast Asia is only the most recent casualty of this kind of claiming. Consider the Dunhuang manuscripts, sealed in a cave sometime around the year 1000, discovered in 1900, when a wandering monk named Wang Yuanlu dislodged a chunk of plaster and found himself staring into a solid mass of ancient paper, centuries of accumulated text pressing back at him through the dark. Foreign teams carried off as many as 46,000 manuscripts between 1907 and 1915, representatives of Britain, France, Russia and Japan, while roughly 14,000 documents remained in China. Today, the hoard is scattered across the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Asiatic Museum in St. Petersburg, and archives from Tokyo to Massachusetts. To whose history do those manuscripts speak? To China's? Tibet's? To all four cultural spheres at once? The answer is more complex than any single nation can claim. Dunhuang sat for centuries at the nexus of four major cultural spheres: China, Tibet, Central Asia, and the steppe. The manuscripts themselves are written in Chinese, Tibetan, Khotanese, Sogdian, Old Uyghur, Sanskrit, Tangut, and Kuchean, among others. They contain not just the official histories studied at court, the records of the grand historian, the history of the Han dynasty, but also banned religious texts, non-canonical Buddhist practices, and the kinds of intimate documents that official history never preserves. Local administrative records showing how land was actually taxed rather than how it was supposed to be taxed, the evidence of lives the court never bothered to record. The cave collected everything, orthodoxy and heresy, state and individual, the powerful and the forgotten. Every nation-state with a claim on that region would like to claim the manuscripts. China holds roughly 14,000 of them in Beijing. Others are scattered across the imperial capitals of Europe and Asia, each institution insisting on its custodial rights. But the manuscripts themselves refuse any single national narrative. They are the accidental corpus of a crossroads, gathered not by archivists, but by proximity, by the fact that everything passed through Dunhuang and some of it stayed. The honest history of the Silk Road looks like this: not a road, not a Chinese achievement, not a European discovery, a network that emerged from the decisions of thousands of individual merchants, pilgrims, monks, soldiers, and refugees crossing mountains and deserts, not because a government told them to, but because there was something worth finding on the other side. Between the 4th and 9th centuries CE, the Sogdians understood this better than anyone. A people of Iranian origin based near what is now Samarkand, they were the great merchants of those routes. They travelled across Eurasia, established colonies across China, translated Buddhist scriptures, and carved their presence into remote mountain rocks in languages that most of the world has never heard of. Chinese chronicles noted their commercial acumen. Their letters, discovered in 1907 in a Chinese watchtower just west of the Jade Gate by the archaeologist Oral Stein, describe abandoned women, market conditions for linen cloth, and the terrifying chaos of a China coming apart at the seams. One letter speaks of the Huns entering the Tang capital. Another describes a merchant abandoned by his commercial partner, forced to return alone to the city of Guzhang. These are not the letters of people in a Chinese story. They are the letters of people in their own story, one that mainstream history keeps trying to absorb or erase. The steppe nomads fare even worse. Too much emphasis has been placed on the initiative of the Han dynasty and Rome, while the nomadic peoples who lived in the vastness of the steppe between them, who maintained the routes, who transported the goods, who were the roads in any living sense, are treated as though they barely existed at all, and yet they are treated as background, peripheral, forgotten. And then there are the mummy people of the Tarim Basin, with their Caucasian features and their woolen burial cloths. The most famous specimen, the Beauty of Loulan, was discovered in 1980 by Chinese archaeologists near Lop Nur and has been dated to approximately 1800 BCE, some 3,800 years ago. She challenges long-held beliefs about early human migration. She belongs to no convenient nationalist story, and so she waits in a museum case while governments argue about what she means. Khodadad Reza Khani has made a devastating case. The term Silk Roads obscures more than it reveals. Its definition has marginalized civilizations like India. The attempts to date its opening with precision are unconvincing. The frame distorts. He is right, and the distortion is not accidental. When we call something the Silk Road, we are not naming the past. We are constructing a usable version of it, a version that can be placed on a government infrastructure map, invoked in a parliamentary speech, argued over by nations who were not there. The name von Richthofen gave that ancient network in 1877 was a label. What it became was a claim. And claims, as history keeps showing us, are what civilizations go to war over. But beneath every claim, beneath every convenient label and parliamentary argument, the actual roots persist, the actual traders, the actual letters from abandoned women in desert outposts, not in the archives of nations who were not there, not in the speeches, not on the infrastructure maps, hidden inside mountain ranges, sealed under millennia of wind and stone, waiting for the instrument patient enough to listen. That instrument arrived in 2024. Imagine a drone ascending through mountain fog in the highlands of Uzbekistan. Below, nothing visible. Scrub, stone, a ridge indistinguishable from 100 others, unchanged by anything but wind for 1,000 years. And then the LiDAR beam begins its work, firing, measuring, listening for the return, and out of the nothing, something emerges. Streets, walls, the unmistakable geometry of a granary, a city, a medieval city called Tugunbulak, inhabited between the 6th and 11th centuries, hidden inside a mountain range at high elevation, invisible to every eye that passed beneath it for a millennium, not lost, not destroyed, simply waiting. The Silk Road is not done being discovered. That sentence is worth sitting with, because we have spent so much of our conversation looking backward at the evidence that has already surfaced, at the fragments and whispers that survived against every probability. But the truth is that the picture is still incomplete, still assembling itself, one LiDAR scan, one genetic analysis, one careful brushstroke in a desert excavation at a time. The earth remembers the actual roots. The story we have been telling is not finished, it is barely begun. What if the cities we have mapped are only a fraction of the cities that existed? What if the documents we have recovered are only the residue of an archive beyond our current imagining? What if that is precisely the point? Yale historian Valerie Hansen spent years trying to understand what the Silk Road actually was. Not the romantic image of vast camel caravans carrying silk from one glittering imperial capital to another. The thing itself, documented in what people actually left behind, and what she found in the trash heaps and the abandoned papers and the accidental archives of Oasis towns, was something both smaller and more astonishing than the myth. She found ordinary people, merchants abandoning their partners in Dunhuang, writing desperate letters home to Samarkand, Buddhist monks cataloguing scripture in languages no one at the monastery fully understood, Sogdian traders with their home in the region near today's Samarkand, a people of Iranian origin whose core territory straddled what is now southern Uzbekistan and western Tajikistan, building colonies across thousands of miles of steppe and desert, managing commerce with a quiet competence that empires would have envied. And Hansen gave us a metaphor worth carrying. She wrote that the Silk Road changed history largely because the people who managed to travel along part or all of it planted their cultures like seeds of exotic species carried to distant lands, thriving in new homes, newcomers mixed with local residents and absorbed other groups who followed. Seeds carried to distant lands, not conquest, not empire, seeds. Consider what actually travelled. Buddhism, born in northern India, moved along the trade routes through Afghanistan and Central Asia into China, carried by monks willing to die crossing the Taklamakan. Nestorian Christianity, declared heretical in the West and expelled from the Roman world, found new soil in Central Asia and moved east along the same corridors, reaching China along the Silk Road, surviving in places the Roman Church could not imagine. The Sogdian language, spoken by those remarkable Iranian origin merchants who built colonies from the Black Sea to the gates of China, became the medium through which Buddhist scripture was translated, through which commercial records were kept, through which letters of heartbreak and financial ruin were scratched onto paper. And when the Sogdian world faded, its script did not die. It became the ancestor of the Mongolian writing system. It became the ancestor of the Uyghur script. It pressed itself into the future, carrying its shape forward through languages it never spoke. And before any of this, long before the caravans, long before the Oasis towns, long before the Han Emperor Wu established the corridor that would eventually become the Silk Road, The same impulse was already at work. Lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, a stone found in abundance in the Kerano-Munjan district of that same highland country, travelled more than 1,200 miles to be pressed into the temples of Sumer by the 3rd millennium BCE. 4,000 years before the Silk Road had a name, the blue of heaven was already moving through mountain passes and across deserts, arriving finally in Mesopotamia to be laid into the eyes of gods. The road was ancient before it was the Silk Road, the impulse to connect, to trade, to carry beauty through impossible terrain. That pattern does not begin with the Han dynasty. It does not begin with Ferdinand von Richthofen, the 19th century German geologist who coined the term. It begins earlier than we have dared to measure, not anomalies, memories, evidence of a world more connected, more restless, more human than we are sometimes permitted to imagine. Now return with me to Cave 17, that small niche, not much bigger than a utility cupboard, carved into the side of Mingsha Mountain outside Dunhuang. Sometime around the year 1000, someone walled up its entrance, and the roughly 60,000 documents inside it disappeared from the world. They waited there for 900 years. When Wang Yuanlu, a wandering monk who had appointed himself guardian of the Mogao grottos, dislodged a chunk of plaster while digging sand from Cave 16 in 1900, he found himself looking at a solid mass of ancient paper. Among those documents was a letter written by a Sogdian woman who had been abandoned in Dunhuang. Found by the British archaeologist Aurel Stein in 1907 in a Chinese watchtower near the Jade Gate, one of 5 letters that scholars date to around 313 CE. It was addressed to her mother and her lord. She is stranded. She is ashamed. She has received no reply. In language that strips away 12 centuries in a single sentence, she describes herself as lower than a dog and a pig in that household. The letter was never sent. It survived not because any empire chose to preserve it, not because any scholar decided it was significant. It survived because the desert is dry, because a Chinese garrison likely confiscated it before it could travel further, and because the arid air of that watchtower kept what human memory discarded. What the letter reveals is this: the Silk Road was not only an artery of commerce and religion, it was a place where people were stranded, abandoned, forgotten, where the machinery of trade could swallow a life as easily as it could carry a faith across a continent. The manuscripts around that letter are also accidental survivors. The official histories, the court records, the grand proclamations carved into stone by dynasties that wanted to be remembered, much of that is gone. What remains is the residue of lives that no one thought worth preserving. Between 1907 and 1915, foreign expeditions from Britain, France, Russia, Japan carried off as many as 46,000 of those manuscripts from Dunhuang in transactions that scholars continue to debate. Wang Yuanlu was paid for access. The circumstances are contested. What is not contested is where the documents ended up: the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the Asiatic Museum in St. Petersburg. The balance, roughly 14,000 documents, remained in China. To study the full collection today, you must travel across continents, navigate institutional archives in multiple languages, request access to materials that historian Peter Hopkirk described as the fruit of long-range archaeological raids. The road that carried silk also carried scripture and also carried loss. The pattern repeats. But here is what I want you to hold on to as we reach the end of this journey. The most transformative exchanges in human history have almost never happened at the centres. They happened at the margins, in the oasis towns, not the imperial capitals. Among the Sogdian merchants who had no army, no navy, no state apparatus behind them, only their networks, their acumen, their willingness to cross a desert. Among the displaced, the stateless, the in-between. The Nestorian Christians who lost their argument in Rome and carried their faith east along trade routes. The Buddhist monks who walked from China into India and back again, carrying texts across passes so high they described the sky as a different color. The woman in Dunhuang who scratched her desperation onto paper, who gave us in that act of private grief a document that mainstream history would never have bothered to carve into stone. Her voice reached us across 12 centuries not because she was powerful, because the desert kept her, because someone sealed a wall, because a monk digging sand in 1900 hit something unexpected and stopped. This is the evidence that the conventional timeline cannot explain away, that the record of human connection, the genuine, documented record, is always larger, always older, always stranger than the official version permits. The Tarim mummies, Caucasian in appearance and extraordinarily well preserved in the arid basin of Western China, continue to yield findings that challenge established models of early migration. DNA analysis, including work published as recently as 2022 in journals examining the site of Yingpan, suggests complex admixtures of Sintashta and Andronovo populations with additional ancestry from BMAC and Tarim populations, findings that researchers are still working to fully interpret. The manuscripts hidden in mountain archives along old caravan routes contain languages that scholars are still deciphering. And in the highlands of Uzbekistan in 2024, a drone-fired LiDAR pulses into mountain fog and found a city that had been sitting there, unremarked, for 1,000 years. We are still learning what the Silk Road was. We are still finding what it left behind. Consider what the seed metaphor actually means when you press it against the record. A Buddhist sutra carried west by a monk willing to die for it, planted in the sand of a desert library, waiting 9 centuries for a wandering guardian to break a wall. The Sogdian script, shaped by Iranian mouths to record the price of linen cloth and the grief of abandonment, growing into the alphabet through which Mongol emperors would govern half the known world. A blue stone from an Afghan mountain moving through the hands of middlemen across the Iranian plateau, arriving in Mesopotamia to become the substance of gods. These are not metaphors. They are documented transactions. They are the receipts that survive when empires do not. And somewhere in the fog above an Uzbek mountain, the grid of a forgotten city is still resolving into clarity. The road is not over. The earth still remembers. And we are still, improbably, listening.